U.S. aircraft carriers gather in the Indo-Pacific region on a scale not seen since World War II. Would the U.S. defend Taiwan if China launches an attack? A Chinese officer floats the prospect of nuclear war. Chinese aggression now a hot topic for Japan. In response, the nation is teaming up with allies like the U.S. and France. No Chinese app, no Winter Olympics. That's what Beijing has to say for athletes arriving for the Games. They are required to upload health details to the software, but reports say the platform poses security risks. And another nation labels Beijing's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang as genocide. The move follows similar declarations from the US, UK, Canada, and the Netherlands. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we start, China news may seem chaotic. With so much information swirling in the news, we want to offer you a look at the bigger picture to help you make sense of the details. If you haven't already, use the link in the description box and subscribe to our China in Focus newsletter. On top of offering the highlights of what's going on, it also gives the much-needed context behind those stories. And once in a while, you'll also get a peek into some behind-the-scenes content to see what we're up to. Every Friday morning, the latest will land in your inbox. Today, we look to the Indo-Pacific region, military matters, as well as other issues. The U.S.'s adversaries are holding joint military drills. Trilateral naval exercises involving China, Russia, and Iran started on Friday in the Indian Ocean's northern reaches. Iran state media said 11 of its vessels were joined by 3 Russian ships, including a destroyer and 2 Chinese vessels. The naval drills were expected to span some 10,000 miles. They include night fighting practice, rescue operations, and firefighting drills. China, Russia, and Iran started doing joint naval drills in 2019. This drill is the third since then, but it won't be the last. A spokesman for the drill says they intend to continue in the future. Iran has sought to step up military cooperation with China and Russia amid tensions with the United States. Though it seems China and Iran aren't the only countries working with Russia. Recent reports say Russia worked with India to develop supersonic cruise missiles, and that those missiles have been sold to the Philippines. Both India and the Philippines recently had conflicts with China. U.S. Navy ships are gathering en masse in the Indo-Pacific region. According to a strategic study unit out of China's Peking University, satellites have captured the Carl Vinson aircraft carrier strike group sailing into waters north of the disputed Spratly Islands. Both China and the Philippines claim the islands as their own. The carrier entered the South China Sea last week. There, it completed a 5-day joint drill with the U.S. Navy's Essex Amphibious Ready Group on Sunday. On board the USS Carl Vinson is an aircraft called the F-35C. It's the world's only long-range stealth strike fighter. And nearby, another nuclear-powered supercarrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, is poised for deployment. That's from its home port, the Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan. And earlier this month, yet another American carrier strike group dispatched to the Indo-Pacific region. The USS Abraham Lincoln headed out from its home port in San Diego, also armed with F-35C fighter jets. According to the United States Naval Institute, over 24 F-35 fighters are underway in the Western Pacific amid growing tension between the U.S. and China. The U.S. is strengthening its alliance with a key country east of China, Japan. They jointly tackled issues relating to China as well as other regional threats. On Friday, President Biden met with the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in a virtual meeting. Biden said the U.S.-Japan alliance is the cornerstone of peace and security in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. The online meeting lasted just under an hour and a half. It is the first substantial talk between the two countries since Japan's new prime minister took office. The two countries discussed cooperating closely to deal with China-related issues. Some of those include the East and South China Sea, Hong Kong, and the Xinjiang region. Prime Minister Kishida said that they agreed to advance cooperation with other allies to bring about a free and open Indo-Pacific. The two sides also talked about Russia and Ukraine and North Korean missile issues. Kishida also said Japan would host a meeting of the Quad, which includes the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Japan isn't just teaming up with the U.S. The nation also wants to boost cooperation with France. This is the Japanese foreign minister.
Today, we would like to deepen discussions to raise cooperation between Japan and France and Japan and the EU to another level to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Foreign and defense ministers from both Japan and France met on Thursday. France's involvement may come as a surprise to some, given its location. But it, too, holds a stake in the issue, as it controls some overseas territories in the Indo-Pacific. In recent months, China has been increasing its aggression in the Indo-Pacific region, like using military pressure to coerce its neighbors.
In the Indo-Pacific region, there are continuous attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by coercion. The security environment has become tougher and has elevated instability for Japan and France.
Japan's defense minister says the two countries should work more closely because France and Japan share what he calls mutual core values. In a scenario where Beijing invades Taiwan, what should the U.S. do? Most Americans from both political parties say the United States should militarily assist Taiwan. That's according to a new poll by the Trafalgar Group this month. Over 1,000 likely voters were surveyed. Regardless of their party affiliation, more voters believe in maintaining Taiwan's de facto independence amid Beijing's threats. And roughly 60% of respondents said the U.S. ought to defend Taiwan. The survey presents a significant development in public perception concerning the self-ruled island and the Chinese Communist Party. As early as last August, for example, a survey from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs suggested that nearly half of all Americans opposed selling military equipment to Taiwan. And now, according to U.S. officials, the country is looking for ways to potentially accelerate delivery of the next generation of newly built F-16 fighter jets to arm Taiwan against Beijing. The $8 billion deal was approved in 2019, and 66 newly built F-16 aircrafts are scheduled to be delivered by 2026. By then, the delivery will bring Taiwan's total number of F-16s to more than 200, one of the largest F-16 fleets in Asia. Beijing isn't letting up its pressure on Taiwan, but it may be testing the waters to see if the U.S. and other allies would come to the island's aid in case of war. Fang Bing, a senior colonel for China's military, gave recent remarks while on air with state broadcaster CCTV. He stated that during a hypothetical war, U.S. aircraft carriers would be within kill range of Chinese missiles the moment they enter the South China Sea. He went on to explain China would also attack the airport where U.S. airplanes take off, destroy American aircraft carriers for sure, and then upgrade the conflict to a nuclear war. In the end, Fang challenged the U.S., asking whether Washington really wanted to wage a nuclear war with China and destroy the Earth in the process. This isn't the first time Fang has discussed taking Taiwan under Beijing's control by any means necessary. 10 years ago, he talked about that possible cost in an interview. At the time, he said China is in a position to go back to the Stone Age together with America. He also added, now we can slap the table and say to the Americans, you'll give up your 200 cities and we'll give up our 200 cities. Do you dare to play this game with us? Fang's recent remarks prompted a number of comments on social media. One of them seems to touch on the heart of the matter, the values held by democracies versus communist systems. It reads, Chinese people don't know that they are the real cost. Americans dare not play the game because they value people's lives. China dares to play. The whole world knows it. Australia and Britain will fight back. That's what the Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton said on Thursday. He made it clear that along with Britain, they won't put up with cyber attacks from China, Russia, or Iran. Dutton said both the UK and Australia are the target of regular attacks from these countries, though all three claim to have nothing to do with such attacks. So how do the two countries plan to fight back? Australia and the UK agreed to coordinate cyber sanctions on those regimes to increase deterrence. The move could raise the cost of hostile state activity in cyberspace. In addition, they plan to invest in infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region. Britain's Foreign Secretary said in a statement, the UK is committed to building a network of liberty, and that means championing democracy by supporting countries in the Indo-Pacific to resolve their development needs. Now we turn to a disaster-stricken country in the South Pacific, Tonga. After a massive volcanic eruption rocked the islands, several countries are pledging financial aid, including China. Last Saturday, an underwater volcano erupted, triggering a tsunami that inundated the islands. New Zealand was the first to announce a grant of nearly $70,000 and mobilize its army to help Tonga. Australia followed, sending aid, and a day later, China pledged $100,000. But China's offer appears to be sparking concern from Australia and New Zealand. Jonathan Pryke, a foreign policy think tank expert based in Sydney, tells the Washington Post that this is a soft power game. He says if you needed an extra driver to respond to whatever needs Tonga may have, then of course there is China lurking in the background. And former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd tweeted on Wednesday that Australia must be the first to give Tonga assistance. He wrote, failing that, China will be there in spades. China had previously provided Tonga with more than $100 million to rebuild after devastating riots in 2006. But that was a loan, not aid, and this debt has almost threatened to bankrupt Tonga. As of today, Tonga still owes China $108 million. That's almost two-thirds of all of Tonga's debt. To get into Beijing's Winter Olympics, Team USA is required to give up their health data to a Chinese app. But a research group says the app has security flaws that could put their data at risk. And that wouldn't be limited to their health data either. NTD's Juliet Song has more on this.
American athletes heading to Beijing's Winter Olympics have to do one thing before they're allowed into the country: download an app. Beijing is requiring athletes to upload their personal information through it. That includes their passport details, body temperature records, respiratory symptoms, and medications. But now, a cybersecurity research group says the app has major security flaws, meaning users could be left vulnerable to hacking and cyberattacks and have health information stolen. The app, called My 2022, is owned by a Chinese state-controlled company. A data security expert breaks down the potential damage of a hack.
One thing that people don't understand about apps in general, whether it's this app or an app developed by Google, an app is basically legal malware. And it enables the developer to conduct surveillance on the end user 24/7, 365 days a year.
Lee says some app permissions allow the software's developers to collect attachments.
So if you had a bank statement sent to you and it was attached to an email that an app developer can collect, and the email was hacked from the app developer's server, it can contain information such as your bank information or medical information, your social security information, passwords, and so forth.
It's unclear if the Chinese app can collect attachments, but Beijing has so far dismissed security concerns. On top of the security issues, the research group points to a function of the app, which allows users to report other users' messages, especially those deemed politically sensitive. The developer then decides whether to remove the messages. What's more, the cybersecurity research group found over 2,000 so-called politically sensitive keywords inside the app. The list of keywords appears inactive, but developers can still use them to censor communication. Among the censored keywords are Chinese leader Xi Jinping's name, the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, and Falun Gong, a spiritual discipline that has been targeted by a brutal Beijing persecution campaign for over 2 decades. Juliet Song, NTD News.
President Biden says he is uncertain on whether to lift tariffs on Chinese goods. That's because Beijing hasn't fulfilled its promises.
I'd like to be able to be in a position where I could say they're meeting the commitments, or more of their commitments, and be able to lift some of it. But we're not there yet.
China promised to buy more U.S. goods under Phase 1 of the trade deal made under the Trump administration. But a recent report says Beijing only hit just over 60% of its purchasing goal. Former President Trump imposed tariffs on China starting in 2018. He said the U.S. was hurting from unfair trade between the two countries and that the U.S. buys more goods from China than China buys from the U.S. The tariffs aim to pressure Beijing to buy more U.S. goods. The tariffs impact over $500 billion worth of Chinese imports, though American companies are allowed to apply for exemptions for certain products. Now, more than 140 lawmakers are calling on the U.S. Trade Representative to expand that exemption list. They say it's to help U.S. companies that were relying on Chinese goods and now are struggling to adjust their supply chains. If the lawmakers are successful, the change would boost Chinese goods coming to the U.S. And in France, lawmakers recognized China's treatment of Uyghurs as genocide. This just 2 weeks before the Beijing Winter Olympics. On Thursday, France's parliament passed a motion asking the government to condemn China for crimes against humanity and genocide. The non-binding motion was adopted with 169 votes for and 1 vote against. The motion also asked the government to protect Uyghur residents in France against any intimidation or harassment by China. So far, the U.S. government, as well as the parliaments of the U.K., the Netherlands, and Canada, have condemned China's treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide. Are the uniforms for the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics linked to forced labor in the Xinjiang region? The International Olympic Committee, or IOC, said on Wednesday, no. The statement comes after a U.S. government agency probed the IOC on the issue. The Congressional Executive Commission on China said the IOC has partnered with Chinese companies to make uniforms that use cotton from the Xinjiang region. The commission says the U.S. now presumes that goods sourced in Xinjiang are made with forced labor, and that cotton produced there is synonymous with forced labor. One of the Chinese companies that the IOC partners with had reportedly quit the Better Cotton Initiative group. That group is a nonprofit which promotes sustainable cotton production. It previously pulled out of Xinjiang, citing increasing risks of forced labor. The IOC's other partner has a factory in Xinjiang and openly advertises products that contain cotton produced there. The U.S. agency says that because the Chinese companies use Xinjiang goods, there is a worrisome possibility that IOC personnel or others attending the 2022 Olympic Games will be wearing clothing contaminated by forced labor. Evergrande says it's hiring more financial and legal advisors to help deal with its debt. The move comes after a group of international creditors threatened to take legal action. NTD's Colin Fredrickson has the details.
Evergrande said Friday it's proposing to hire 2 Chinese firms as financial advisors and a law firm as legal advisor to help deal with debt. That's according to a stock market statement.
This is the beginning of a long working out of the problems of a kind of overheated Chinese real estate market.
Evergrande's move comes after a group of its overseas bondholders threatened legal action over what it calls Evergrande's opaque debt restructuring process. James Nolt is a political economy expert. He thinks this could be the beginning of a more general real estate crisis, partly because a lot of the Chinese property developers are funded by foreign money.
Even if there could be Chinese banks that might, for example, be willing to overlook the condition of default, perhaps because of policy reasons, the foreigners are not willing to do that. You know, they want to get paid for money they've lent.
The international creditors say they've been left in the dark about the company's plans. After talking with Evergrande, they only received little more than vague assurances of intent, lacking in both detail and substance. Nolt says even if Evergrande tries to reschedule its loans, that might not work because it has to have some basic solvency. And he says some of these companies are trapped in bad investments.
It's not clear how much solvency they have, and without let's say, a major government bailout to cover their losses, there might not even be the funds. Even if you stretch out the payments, there might not be the funds to really cover any kind of a program that would be satisfying to the creditors.
Nolt says after years of expanding credit and hiking prices, he thinks there has to be a reckoning, and China's time is coming. Colin Fredrickson, NTD News.
More Chinese real estate developers are facing enormous amounts of debt maturing this year. How can they overcome the problem? And will the Chinese regime step in to help? NTD's Colin Fredrickson reports.
Chinese property developers have $117 billion worth of debt maturing this year, according to Refinitiv data. About a third of it is denominated in dollars, and investors want to know if they can make the payments.
Obviously, they don't have the ability to pay.
Business professor Frank Xie thinks the main reason they'll have trouble paying is because they lack cash due to a decline in sales. China's home sales last month fell 35% compared to the same period a year ago, and developers are facing an unprecedented liquidity squeeze from years of government curbs on borrowing. It led to a string of offshore debt defaults and credit rating downgrades. Although these developers are eager to get help from Beijing, Xie thinks there are two reasons blocking the regime from getting involved.
I don't think China has enough foreign exchange reserve to pay for this kind of things. Especially, it's not just one company; it's just dozens of companies. Leverage is so high, and the debt is so high, and it's just something that unbearable for the central government to shoulder.
The second reason is Chinese Communist Party infighting, and it's possible that Xi might not bail out certain developers because they are from clashing factions. It remains to be seen whether China's developers will be able to negotiate with the creditors to extend deadlines or modify contracts. Colin Fredrickson, NTD News.
Speaking of economic concerns, China's birth rate dropped in 2021 for the fifth year in a row, hitting a new record. China's official data shows 10.6 million babies were born in 2021. That's down 12% from the year before. The decline in birth rates could undercut the ruling party's plans, for example, to develop technology and self-sustaining economic growth based on consumer spending. Experts say the working-age population could fall to half by 2050. Authorities eased birth limits back in 2015, but couples are put off by high education costs, cramped housing, and limited income. A low birth rate leads to an aging population, which will add pressure on the country as it will need to pay and care for an increasingly elderly population. It will also shrink China's workforce. This could severely distress the country's economic and social stability and limit the overall pace of the country's development. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.